Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We are here today, Thursday, April 6th at 10 a.m. for an allowable ex parte briefing. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. I'll recognize our staff counsel, Mr. Stark, to read the docket, or the non-docket.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're here for the proceeding, or the allowable ex parte proceeding in ND-2023-4-ECGWST. This concerns the allowable ex parte communication briefing for or regarding an overview of cybersecurity challenges facing providers of critical infrastructure services. Yes, ma'am. This is scheduled to proceed at Thursday, April 6, 2023 at 10 a.m. in the offices of the Commission. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Before we get into the rules of the road, we do want to recognize that we have Mr. Pringle here as a presenter and Mr. Torrey here as the Office of Regulatory Staff's designee to serve as a neutral. Is that correct? There you go.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Chad Torrey on behalf of ORS.
Thank you. Mr. Stark, would you go through some of our rules of the road for today, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Madam Chair. So the subject matter notice to be discussed today relates to cybersecurity challenges facing providers of critical infrastructure services. This, I would remind everyone, is a briefing and not a hearing. The briefing must be conducted in compliance with the provision of South Carolina Code Section annotated 58-3-260C, and the requirements of that statute are, in part, that the allowable ex parte briefing be confined to the subject matter which has been noticed. I would therefore ask the presenters, the commissioners, and staff to please refrain from discussing any matters not related to the specific topics or the notice topics. The statute prohibits any presenter, commissioner, or commission staff from requesting or giving any commitment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to an ultimate issue which is either is or is likely to come before the commission. I would ask the presenters or the presenter, the staff, and the commissioners to refrain from referencing any report, article, statute, or document of any kind that are not included in today's presentation. A copy of any document which is referred to during the briefing will be must be provided to the Office of Regulatory Staff for inclusion into the record, which will be certified by the Chief Clerk of the Commission, Ms. Jocelyn Boyd. If anyone during the course of this briefing exceeds the scope or does not comply with or fails to conduct themselves within the provisions of the South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260 governing the allowable ex parte briefings, it is expected that a contemporaneous objection will be made. And finally, everyone in attendance today must sign in or register. Everyone in the hearing room must read, sign, and return the form which you were given at the door or the to certify that the requirements contained in Section 58-3-260C have been complied with in this presentation. Thank you all, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Good morning, Mr. Pringle.
Good morning, Madam Chair and Commissioners. I am going to actually move over to the podium.
Wherever you're comfortable.
All right, I'll take my fancy placard with me, too.
I think we know who you are.
I was directed to bring a placard for all presenters, and I'm a stickler for that. Madam Chair, Commissioners, thanks for the opportunity to make this presentation. I know that you all have a full hearing and regulation consideration calendar, and I hope that this is relatively interesting. If it's not, I hope you'll tell me. I mean that. I would also like for it to be somewhat interactive, meaning, you know, having a discussion about some of these things. And also, let me say at the start, and this was made clear when I asked for this, I'm here not on behalf of any particular client. This is something, an area where I spend a fair amount of time and attention, and I find these things interesting and pertinent, and I just thought it would be, might be of interest to the commission and the ORS and perhaps to the larger community. I've chosen, and I also wanted to be part of a proceeding that, as Mr. Stark referenced, was EGTCWS, that it encompassed essentially all of the industries and areas that the commission has some regulatory oversight, because cybersecurity obstacles, issues, threats, challenges apply to all sectors and businesses and individuals, and have a particular valence and resonance now, as we'll talk about, because those sectors are also considered to be critical infrastructure sectors. So I'll just get started on the presentation and we can talk through that. I've chosen the term thinking in information and operational systems, observations on cybersecurity and resilience for critical infrastructure and for all of us, because again, these challenges of a connected world, a digital world, where so much business and commerce, well, I don't know the distinction between business and commerce, but is being conducted electronically and using connected networks and an internet and things that are digital. And I'll sort of go through it. I'll start with a quote, and I'm going to use the term systems and describe this as we go through, is, a loss of resilience can come as a surprise because the system usually is paying much more attention to its play than to its playing space. And as we go through this, and I'll explain a little bit more what I'm talking about, is that all of a sudden, critical infrastructure providers, or those who manage critical infrastructure assets, have recognized, as the rest of us have, that in a connected world where there are a great many benefits to having these devices that can do all of our banking and can do transactions almost effortlessly and instantly, that being connected might have some potential risks and downsides. That once you start doing things on connected networks and essentially you connect yourself to the entire world, there are some risks involved in that. So in just a quick agenda, I'll talk a little bit about systems, some threats to critical infrastructure systems, and I'm going to define those things as we go through too. A high-level description of some security threats that these industries and these types of providers face, some general security concepts, and then a brief mention of the relatively brand new National Cybersecurity Strategy that makes this even more timely, this presentation, or at least I think it does. You can disagree with me, and I hope you do. So let's start off just with the way things have been historically. And I'm using the term system, and this may not be the only definition of system, and system being just sort of a collection of certain processes and things. A traditional utility system, and pick any one of them, and I'm gonna have some images of them, have the various elements that are part of it. You have human beings that are operating certain areas, certain facilities. They are managing things. They are monitoring. They're rolling trucks. They are fixing lines. They are laying pipe. They are working on telecommunications networks. You pick. They're driving trucks. They are in the logistics area. just take any one of these. You've got human elements with certain amounts of expertise and experience and management. And then you've got physical assets. And all of you know from doing rate cases and other types of proceedings is that you think about the physical assets that make up utility systems of various types. And we'll talk about that in a second. Those things, those elements, are also interconnected to other things. They are put together. If you think of the electric grid and the way that generation, transmission, distribution are connected to one another, for example. A telephone network is a perfect example of that. But then there are also interconnection that, say, a water and wastewater system is also connected to the electrical system. I mean, there's power that's required for those things. So they're interplay between those elements. And then thirdly, for a function or a purpose. And this commission knows as well as anybody the function or the purpose of what the provision of electricity, the provision of natural gas, telecom services, outputs, the reasons that you have a system and that those elements work together in order to create something or to provide a service. And these are just some examples, and don't want to even go into some of the particulars of this, but one of the reasons I included some of these diagrams is that when you're looking at systems and trying to understand them, how they work and how changes to certain elements or interconnections can change the system, it's a really good idea to take a real step back and to see things from that 10,000 foot view. As I've attempted to learn about these kinds of things or about information and cybersecurity, you can really very easily get lost in the details. And sometimes it's important to pan out. But you can see on here is that a lot of the different elements that are involved in water and wastewater service. There's treatment, there's removing solids, there's discharge, there's delivery of chemicals, there's filtration, there are electric lines. And you can see, even from a diagram like that, how some of these elements and the connections between them work together in order to create drinking water or to treat wastewater so that it can then be, the discharge takes place. Likewise, electricity systems are a collection of the kinds of elements that make up the generation, transmission, and distribution areas. And you can see there just, again, at a very, very high level, the kinds of elements that work together on an interconnected basis in order for a purpose of various types. And you can see on this diagram, I'm already giving away some of the things that I'm going to be talking about that weren't necessarily part of the old or traditional system, which used to just have physical and human assets. You see there's down there networked consumer devices. And I'm going to get to that about how some of these information technologies are working their way into systems. And then just very quickly, natural gas systems and the way that the elements of that type of system, where you go from gas wells to pipelines to processing to compressing to power plants to other types of transmission. And once you start to see systems as this collection of things and processes and connections, and then for a particular purpose, it can be kind of helpful in understanding not only how they work, but also how, when you introduce new factors or new elements, that they can become very complex, and that certain things that take place can have pretty profound changes to those things. So I'll go ahead and give you a definition of critical infrastructure, and this comes straight from the U.S. Code. that these are systems and assets that are so vital to the U.S. that them not working or being destroyed are going to have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, public health, or safety, or any combination of these matters. And this is sort of self-evident in the public utility context, as you all know, because of the importance of things like clean water and wastewater, and properly treated wastewater and electric power and natural gas for reliability, for safety, for consumers to stay alive. But, that's actually been codified. And as I mentioned before, the critical infrastructure sectors, and there are a number of them, and this isn't all of them, but they include communications, which is what used to be telephone networks, which are now also data networks. And that's one reason I didn't necessarily have a diagram in those previous slides, because the telecom network, even though some things have kind of remained the same, have become vastly different over the last few years. And likewise, a railway system, in some form too. But communications, energy, transportation systems, and water and wastewater systems are all designated as critical infrastructure sectors in the United States. And that's significant for the reasons that I'm going to talk about, as well as other types of threats and the like. And this is from a presidential policy directive that it is the policy of the United States to strengthen the security and resilience of its critical infrastructure against both physical and cyber threats. I'm going to be focusing on the cyber threats, although there certainly are, and this is well documented, there are physical threats that are taking place to this infrastructure as well, and sometimes the cyber and the physical can overlap. I thought I'd also, and I'll get out of the definitions section and with all this text, but I wanted to include the term resilience because, and if you go back to the previous definition, is that the policy is to strengthen security and resilience. I think we generally have a pretty good idea of what we think security is: keeping something safe, keeping something guarded, protecting it. We all use, it's no secret that the term firewalls is used in connection with computers, and that ideas of like castle-like security is sometimes. But resilience, even though it is becoming a buzzword in some ways, doesn't nearly get as much play, but it's every bit as important, I would suggest, in the cybersecurity context, because as the definition describes, it means being able to prepare, being adaptable, being able to withstand, and be able to recover rapidly when something bad happens. And, it's recovering from deliberate attacks, accidents, or naturally occurring threats or incidents. And, you may have heard it said, people say that there's two types of companies: those that have been breached and those that don't know it yet. I'm not so sure that that's quite, but what I've realized in being around this area for a while is that, and that you see this term or this description used in other contexts too, you're gonna get punched. And the key is how quickly you get back up and how prepared you were for it. Do you have a plan in place in case something threatening happens? Can you pivot? Can you adapt? Can you learn from your experiences? After action, can you figure out, well, wait a minute, how can we improve upon our posture and keep moving? And how are we flexible enough to keep up with evolving threats and to learn to use new technologies and to train our people and to implement processes that will enable us to continue to evolve the same way technology is evolving, the same way the threat environment is evolving, and keep moving rather than to be stuck in one particular place. And so now, with what I'll tell you about a little bit about this, all of these networks and connected devices and sensors and the ability to transmit, to store information and send it digitally and immediately, is our utility systems now are a combination of both the operations and information systems. And so the elements now have those same physical assets that have always existed, the same or some of the same human beings that are operating them and managing them, but you've also got cyber elements too. You've got interconnection between networks and assets, and you've got lots of different new devices and connections that are very useful and have a lot of benefits, and I'll talk about a couple of those. But at the same time, because they're connected and because they are computer-based, they are not as secure and potentially not as resilient as perhaps traditional assets or networks have been, and that creates a lot of challenges. And now the function or purpose of these things, again, there's a great deal of potential from, and I'll talk about this in a second, to being able to monitor from afar an asset, facilities of various types, to not have to have a human being walking to check it every day, not having to have scores of people to walk a right of way in order to determine, damage or things like that. A lot of benefits, but with those benefits come the challenges of making sure that those devices are not vulnerable to being attacked or to other types of mischief or accident or damage. And those systems are changing. This is just a follow-up. There's so much more devices. And I should have defined this before, is that these utilities and other providers have both information technology systems that they use to manage the kinds of things that most businesses do. They manage their payroll, they manage communications, they manage business functions, but they also have operations technology. And those are the kinds of things where computers and other sensors might be used to help monitor and actually run utility facilities. They might turn switches on and off. They might modify amounts of chemicals that are going into certain things. They might turn on and off parts of pipeline infrastructure. Again, and that's that last point, more automated, autonomous, and remote functions. There's a lot to be said for being able to be in a control room or area and to choose and keep an eye on lots of things at once, but there are some potential downsides to that too. So what's the problem? I say with that, if we've got all this, isn't technology just an unvarnished good? Aren't we headed towards a utopia where we'll be able to do more with less and to automate things and require fewer and make fewer mistakes and do more things more quickly and increase efficiency? Well, at a high level, the difficulty at its most basic level is the internets were not designed with security in mind. Unlike the telephone network, which was a closed network, the internets, and you can go back to its founding, were designed to provide lots of connections, to enable information to easily go between different types of computer networks, to share things, to send things very, very quickly. And again, there's a lot of upside to that. But what it has meant is that as a result of having these computers that default to open, you know, and this may be changing some, but you buy a computer or a server, all of the connections and ports are sort of set to connect to other people, are set to be accessed. I don't know whether this is still the case, but you know, the default password on lots of, you know, servers and other types of equipment has historically been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or wait for it, password. So as a result, we're having to build in or bake in or graft on or layer on security after we've all gotten a lot of the benefits of having these connected things that enable all this communication. And then a third point, and this is actually mentioned in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, is with respect to software, quick to market is not the same thing as security by design. And getting something and making something available and then relying on it to be patched over time is not inherently secure. And that means a lot in the critical infrastructure context, because critical infrastructure providers who are managing and overseeing these very important networks have to be able to rely on software the same way they do on hard assets and equipment to be secure. And one of the points the National Cybersecurity Plan makes is that right now software is inherently, at least in some instances, inherently unsafe. And without undertaking the ongoing security measures, open computers, networks, and software are going to be compromised. There's two examples I want to give about the digital world, and this is the one. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And that points out is that in a digital world, anyone can claim to be anyone they want to be. And in fact, that fact is what has led to a great deal of the kinds of fraud that has taken place, or attempted fraud that may have been in your own email box and all of ours, asking to pay something or to do something or to meet somebody, or and that's another consequence of, you know, of a world that is connected and where there isn't necessarily identity protection or authentication the same way it would be when you meet face to face. And again, it's part of the challenge. And likewise, this is how an open network looks to hackers. Now that's a stock photo. I'm not sure what role the banjo player plays in that. I don't think I saw him when I pulled this down, but I use this as an example is because threat actors will automatically seek to search and find network connections and ports and open doors essentially on the internet, and will do so in a very sort of routine fashion. And, you know, just as a barn with no doors on it or no windows on it and falling down would be easily compromised or accessed, that is the same way that network or equipment appears on the internet if an organization has not taken steps to secure it, to lock down those ports, to think about, well, are we vulnerable? Because again, the default is you open up the box and you're vulnerable. And you've got to layer those things out. And that's why I'm making reference to my opening slide about resilience and not realizing their playing space. The playing space now for just about everything is connected networks and the internets. And in order to play there, you've got to understand and take an active role in making sure that not only your assets are secure and that you've taken steps there, but the people you're working with are also equally as aware and skeptical and trained in order to be able to respond to threats and to be part of an active security program. And this is one area, and this could be the source of an entire discussion, but industrial control systems refer to lots of different ways in which critical infrastructure providers and others can use remote access and monitoring in order to keep an eye on, and in some instances to operate utility facilities. You can see there some of the ICS devices, just managing pipeline, turning it on and off, turning switches and breakers on and off, advanced metering infrastructure, that can monitor and track meters. All of those things are varieties of industrial control systems. And as this slide shows, and this is from something from the General Accounting Office, because they are connected or potentially connected to the internets and to other networks, they are also potentially accessible by threat actors and bad actors. And this, of course, becomes even more of concern and urgency in the last several years, where the pandemic had all of us working remotely rather than just certain individuals, and working remotely and outside the relative or presumed relative protections of an organization where you have to connect to or tunnel in. That creates another level of vulnerability that has to be managed. And we'll talk about that in a second. So what are some of the cyber threats to critical infrastructure? The ability to disrupt processes, email compromise, both within an organization and for those third-party vendors with whom you do business, stealing customers' personal data or credit card information from billing systems, and installing malicious programs like ransomware, which can disable business enterprises or also process control operations, meaning the operations technology. Now, I do realize now that disrupt processes and the first and the fourth bullets are relatively similar, but the bottom line is that these threats could not only take somebody offline or interrupt very important services and processes, but they also, introduce a great deal of just business risk in trying to manage and respond and react to a threat in real time. Just think of it this way. I mean, if your lives are relatively busy right now and your days are spent doing important commission business, consider what it would be like if layered on top of that was a particular incident that not only did you have to manage, but you had to determine what had happened, what you needed to do, how you needed to respond, and all of those elements. So it can be very, very disruptive in addition to the kinds of damage that it can cause. Disrupting processes, and I've been in the references, describe a little bit more about this, but the city of Oldsmar in Florida, at the water treatment plant, they had enabled remote access so that you could troubleshoot, which is a great idea to be in other locations and you can troubleshoot and take an idea. Well, a remote access user was opening or changing some functions that control the amount of sodium hydroxide in the water, and then change the level of sodium hydroxide from 100 parts per million to 11,100 parts per million. Luckily, somebody was watching, and there were controls in place long before something actually affected it. Anybody know what sodium hydroxide is? lie. And so, and there were, and it was, clearly they had, or presumably, some difficulties with the security processes for their remote access that they tuned up after this, and they did manage to keep it, in part because they had some layered security. They had more controls. They wouldn't just let one person have the only access to that, but it was certainly showing that that's a viable threat. Another, and this is somewhat of an outlier, but it certainly really shook up the security community in 2015. And I learned in the last year or so that it's not Kiev, it's Kyiv, but that an operator was watching as a hacker took down 30 substations in and around Kyiv as a result of a very sophisticated, long-running incident that ended up compromising, and actually was the first time that at least that are aware that physical electrical utility assets were shut down as a result of a remote hack, and that operation also involved, interestingly enough, sort of doing a brute force attack on the call center for that particular electric company, so that there was additional chaos taking place at exactly the same time, in creating that. And it's just a demonstration that those things, that there's, going to have to be an ongoing security program that is aware of these potential threats. Third type, or another type I mentioned, is that email compromise. And I just used here is the ability that, when you're seeing an email that sounds too good to be true, or is asking you for something, hovering above it, that it might not be Jack Pringle at arlaw.com, but Hackerty McHackerson at stealmymoney.com. Not a real thing, but an example of the kind of awareness that will stave off some of that. Realize that these types of email compromises, or potential ones, cost the bad actors nothing. In essence, I mean, it doesn't cost any money to send emails, and you can send them out in millions. And if you get one person who clicks, then some bad things can happen. Installing.
Jack, this is Tom Irvin.
Sure.
Would you take a question?
Oh, absolutely, please.
I'd like to know more about, are there national standards for investor-owned utilities, or best practices in terms of how to plan and prepare and respond to these threats?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. And I think I'm gonna avoid perhaps identifying them directly, but the answer is yes across all of those particular industry sectors. I think the challenge has been, in part, that there is not necessarily one federal government agency that has been responsible for cybersecurity across the span, and some of those things come from the particular sectoral regulators that take place at the federal level. But not only are there some of those types of that type of guidance, but there is much more that is taking place to supplement that, and in fact to provide for some enforcement of that and some auditing of those kinds of things. So I guess the best way to describe it is that it's certainly been on the front burner for a number of different types of utilities historically, but it is now, the heat is turned up a great deal more, and there's a lot more emphasis on establishing those best practices, implementing them, and then providing oversight so that they are being followed and being improved.
Do you see state public service commissions having some role in trying to ensure that best practices are being followed, or is it going to be primarily a federal role?
At least what I've observed, and I didn't approach this from necessarily, but that it's a good question about surveying other state public service commissions and PUCs, but in my experience, a lot of that has been at the federal level.
Thank you.
But great questions, and please weigh in if others want to. Another, inserting malicious programs, Colonial Pipeline had a ransomware attack that affected its IT network, information technology network, not the operations technology network that might have been monitoring and doing processes on its pipeline. But as a precaution, Colonial shut down its OT network. And, I don't have the stats right in front of me, but Colonial Pipeline, the amount of natural gas that it carries for the United States is extraordinarily significant. And having that network, that pipeline shut down was, let's just say, not optimal. And that was, ransomware, which is essentially malware or bad software. That's just what malware that somebody clicked or somebody opened an infected attachment, and ransomware freezes up your screen. Sometimes there's a light that goes off. Sometimes there's a bell. Sometimes your computer goes black or red, or that, as they say in Windows, or they used to say in Windows, the blue screen of death. I hope you haven't seen that on your computers, and telling you that if you don't make a payment, usually and I can't believe I got this far without saying Bitcoin, without making a payment, then your data will remain locked up. And that's an ongoing huge challenge, because not only can your data and information all be locked up, but now some ransomware actors are threatening to exfiltrate or take sensitive information and send it out to the world, and other types of bad acts. And so that's a real threat for critical infrastructure and providers. The kinds of causes, and this is just several of them, there's lots of them. Unpatched vulnerabilities, I mentioned software and others, assets that need to be patched. That just means updated, once you discover a bug or a glitch in software, just in the same way Windows issues updates, you have Patch Tuesday or something like that. The reason that's particularly a challenge in the utility industry is that assets that are, and I'm grossly generalizing, but assets that are in use and operating, it's very difficult to patch them in real time. And lots of utilities and critical infrastructure providers are not used to having to figure out how to manage these updates. And historically they were used to having proprietary software, if at all, that wasn't necessarily connected to other networks. And so this is a new set of challenges for an industry or set of industries that have been operating one way and now are adapting to a connected world.
Attorney Pringle?
Yes.
Quick question
Sure.
for you. We always hear about technological advancements and how we can improve efficiency, effectiveness, and the like with those advancements, the cloud, remote abilities, and the like.
Right.
Are there any studies or thoughts on the alternative case, not going forward with some of those advancements and the benefits thereof? As a very simple example, if I decided that I wanted to make sure that my car was secure from a hacker. In my simple mind, I would say invest in a 69 Chevelle. If I wanted to make sure that my house was secure, physically secure, the likelihood of me installing automated locks where I could unlock my house from my phone would be highly unlikely, because if I could do it, someone could hack my phone and then they could also do it, compared to just a turnkey approach.
Right.
Is there any thought, discussion about the benefits and the costs of having, say, closed systems that require human participation as compared to moving more towards automation?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think the way I would answer it is to say there's some part of this, and it reminds me of the great critical infrastructure philosopher Homer Simpson. You know, he said, you know, the internet, is that thing still around? And the point being is it's not going away. And the connections, for example, are going to need to continue to happen. And I'll give you just one example, like distributed energy resources. I mean, there's not going to be a way to say, well, we're gonna stick with closed systems, because there are interconnection requirements. But the way I would sort of approach it is to say there might need to be a little bit more consideration on the front end about looking at those particular risks and benefits of taking a particular approach, as opposed to just assuming that technology is going to be a solution. And as I'll mention in just a second, I'll get there in just a second, is any security program is going to require people, processes, and appropriate use of technology. And it is going to mean perhaps taking a step back and thinking, well, before we get too far down the road, maybe we want to design these products and this software in a way that is more secure. Maybe we want to, you may have heard the term privacy by design or security by design, is that aspect is not an afterthought that we find out afterwards that a particular configuration or product that we didn't think about, well, what are the risks? And in your example, I think it's certainly in some instances that utilities may very well be more on the 69 Chevelle if it has to do, and I'm really broadly, is like on the generation side, like the areas that are farther away from connections, farther away from interconnection, is that, look, we're not going to take particular risks just to get a little bit more efficiency, just to save a little bit, but we will do the analysis as we make decisions about smart metering and other elements, and decide, well, do the customer benefits and the benefits to the company's bottom line, do those outweigh the potential security risks? And you manage them as best you can. So it's a combination of both, but I do think, there's some sense that, and I give a good example. I mean, we're just not going to be able to go back to insisting that I guess I can still write checks, but, doing banking and business electronically is kind of a necessity. You can't just say, I'm going to, that I'm going to avoid those risks entirely just because you may not have any business partners or customers. But it does mean thinking about it beforehand rather than trying to address it after the fact. But it's a great question. Couple of other, human error, is just a huge part of this. Don't ever blame technology for anything. There's always, almost often a human behind it. That malware, insider misuse, somebody within a company or organization who decides to take something or do something, that loss or theft of a device storing information that's famous now for the laptop that somebody runs off with, or, because we've all got so much power in all of these devices that we have. I always use this. My father actually has this, you know, a framed version of this. This is, some of you may remember Pogo, Walt Kelly's, and where he said, "We have met the enemy and he is us." He was actually talking about environmental concerns and degradation, but it applies so much in the security context. Is when we are rushed, when we're tired, when we're greedy, those are when we make mistakes and are subject to being played by bad actors who are no different than traditional confidence people. The same way that it's been done throughout history is inspiring trust, pretending to be somebody who's got something you want, telling you that you need to move real quick and that it might be, you know, worthwhile for you or your organization. The importance of patching software. This was the first renewable energy provider to become the victim of a cyber attack. They lost connection with their generation installation presumably because they didn't patch a firewall, and they were vulnerable. And what was interesting about this particular incident is not clear that the hacker really knew that it was even going after something that was, you know, a critical infrastructure provider. Because again, from the internet, you can't tell. You just see an IP address, or you see a port, and a lot of mischief happens just by sort of happenstance. So I'll just go through, and I didn't realize this was doing, but the business email compromise setup. It's just a scam targeting businesses who regularly perform wire transfer payments. They get into the email system of the company, or pretend to be an email close to the company, and then watch for a large financial transaction about to happen. But understand, sometimes it happens that somebody will actually, because of somebody clicking on a link or something, take over jack.pringle@arlaw.com and then manage the inbox and take all the sent items out so you can't tell that person is in there. And then they sit back and watch and see if somebody's doing a real estate closing or paying something. And then the sting, and I use that term intentionally because it's just like in the movie The Sting, where you're setting somebody up for a fall. Then it looks like it comes from a legitimate source, and I just use jackpringle@alv.com as an example, informs the recipient of a change in wire instructions, and then the recipient wires the funds to the threat actor's bank. And this is no disrespect to Cyprus or Ukraine or other places, but those are banks that you might not be surprised to learn it's kind of hard to get money back from once they land there. And I'll just give you an example of an actual way a BEC happened where somebody got into the email of another's, but and it's been a few years, so it's a little bit stale, but I've changed the names and you might recognize the people involved. So Dabo sends an email on Friday afternoon to Trevor Lawrence, and it's almost always Friday afternoon when everybody's tired and ready to get the end of the week. Hey, are you in today? I've got a wire to send to Renfro Resources. See, I really thought through this. For a Frank Howard funding loan. See, going real deep pull. And so I need you to do this. I need you to handle this wire for me. And essentially, this is like their law partners. Can you do this? This is really important. So it's established urgency and authority. You know, somebody, this is important to me. The next one, well, I'm in today. Well, good. Okay, I got the wiring instructions in Hong Kong, which ought to be a red flag. And it's, of course, going to Bank of America on George Rogers Boulevard, Muschamp International. Granted, remember, this was a couple years ago. Please do it. Do it soon. Let me know that you did it. From Trevor Lawrence, from which sub-account? From our trust account? No time to do this right now. Got to be later. You know, he's working on something else. I really need this to be done by close of business today. Sounds like an order. And then the next thing, today's a crazy day and needs to be done ASAP. Appreciate your help. Then they get this. What do you think the chances are of getting a Hong Kong court order to try to get your money back if you're a South Carolina business or law firm? And that money's gone. And now the FBI and others do have some mechanisms where they try to get that back. But all of that took place because the folks involved weren't necessarily aware of the potential risks. that were involved in that kind of scam, not to recognize, well, wait a minute, this is too fast, or not having somebody else involved in it. So a couple of things, and this is to your point, Commissioner Williams, you need all three of these things: people, technology, and processes. That can also mean policies, that that everybody uses strong passwords, or they have to use remote authentication or various things. In order to have a security program for any type of provider, you can't rely on technology alone, because there are going to be people who don't necessarily how to use it, who are weak links, and who aren't following processes. This is from W. Edwards Deming, who did a lot of that total quality management, but I use this all the time. If you can't describe what you're doing as a process, then you don't know what you're doing. And I'd suggest to any organization that is trying to do a security program, think about what it would be like if you were explaining your reasonable security procedures to a regulator, or shall we say a jury of 12 of your peers. Thinking about it ahead of time, planning and putting something into place is really important.
Jack,
Yes.
a really sad situation that happened. It's been a couple of years or longer. An elderly lawyer who had dementia got this thing about send the money to Africa, and he did. He wiped out his firm, even in the trust account. Unfortunately, he died before anything could be done with it. But when you get people in a certain mental state, that it becomes really dangerous.
Sure.
Really dangerous.
And I don't know what the solution is in smaller firms, but it's the same ideas that you have one person handling the checks, the checkbook, and a different person looking at the banking statements. It's a lot of the same sort of things. You confirm, and I'll mention this in a second, but this, having multi-factor authentication, meaning you find out if a wire instruction change comes in, you have a process in place where you call somebody. Although sometimes they've even got cell phone numbers, they know your cell phone number, or you use some other method. That's called out-of-band authentication to recognize, but it's hard to do.
Well, and by the time it was discovered by others in the office, or even got to ODC, it was just too late.
Right.
I mean,
It happens very rapidly, and that's again, one of the benefits of this economy is that you can do transactions, and again, sometimes there's some settlement that takes place, but knowing ahead of time that that's a potential risk is really important, and trying to put those controls into place. But great point, and terrible situation. Training the pause. I include this not just because I was sending a client an email on a Saturday, but you see a lot of companies saying, slow down. This is coming from outside the organization. Be careful about links and attachments. Pause, think, be skeptical rather than falling for it quickly. Train to be skeptical. I made up this email, but it was just Jack, process a wire of $6 million to the attached wiring instructions, and give Thornton as our managing partner. That might be, alluring. Wow, boy, I can really curry favor in the firm if I get this done. But that skepticism has to follow through. Secure remote access, as I mentioned, when you got people that are working remotely, you got to have that multi-factor authentication. You got to, to verify your identity, because remember, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And if that dog, you've got to do something separately. I'll tell you very briefly, some years ago, I got an email early in the morning, that said, from my friend Robert Ducklow, who said, hey, Jack, it's Robert. I'm over in London and I lost my passport. Can you help me? And I thought, well, wait a minute. I know that this is. So I separately went out and sent him an email. The email address I had said, hey, Ducklow, I think somebody's, hacked your account. 10 minutes later, no, Jack, it's me, Ducklow. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. And then I said, well, wait a minute, hold on. I do this for a living. And so I emailed him. I said, what's Jim Coyle's nickname? What was Jim Coyle's nickname in college? Silence. So, you just, that skepticism and recognizing, make him make somebody validate who they are and recognize when the language is a little bit off, when something seems a little bit of punctuation or anything else and it's urgent. You just slow down and don't fall for it. And that's hard to train, but anybody who's handling any money or doing, and it's a particular problem in procurements and things, because there's all of these email strings with vendors and forwards and everything else, and it's very easy to say, oh well, payment has changed, but you got to slow down and not fall. We've all gotten used to the fact that we ought to be able to do something immediately. I want this transaction done immediately, but security requires to slow down and to verify and authenticate. Implement access controls. I pulled this one because some of us in the room and on the line are old enough to remember when our grandparents and others had a room that was off limits and you could not go in there on pain of some sort of imprisonment or worse, and plus the plastic on the couches too, which is really classy. But that's just the idea that, remember how I said that computers default to open? You got to tune that down so that if you're storing sensitive information or things that are important to the organization, don't give everybody in the whole organization access to it. Only on a need to know, need to use. And you can tune those things down, but it's not going to happen by default. And knowing that ahead of time, and then deciding if you wanted to perhaps maybe encrypt sensitive information, and under these laws that require notification to customers or interested people when a security incident takes place, encryption is a safe harbor. Encryption is just you jumble it. You make it so that anybody, even if anybody got it, they couldn't make sense of it. But those are kinds of things that you got to think about on the front end rather than afterwards. And then, as we're getting towards the end here, responding to a security incident. And somebody told me this years ago, a crisis is not the best time to exchange business cards. Meaning, a crisis is not necessarily the best time to try to find a forensic security consultant to help you figure out if something went wrong. A crisis is not the time, or security incident is to try to find, well, who can help us with deciding whether we need to do notifications. And that's why I always mention you play like you practice. And I use this term having an incident response plan, and I can guarantee you these jurisdictional utilities, especially have created and practiced those kinds of things, like a tabletop that says, okay, we get hit by a ransomware here. Who's involved? What do we do? What's next? Who do we call? And even just having a sheet of paper with names and phone numbers and contact information is really important. I'll just sum up by, and this could be the subject of an entire day. This is the National Cybersecurity Plan and its 5 pillars. Won't go through all of them, but the one that's really interesting is the shape market forces to drive security and resilience, and that's presumably to try to encourage makers of software and other devices and of the Internet of Things that you may have heard of, the devices, to build more secure assets so that those assets and software and other things can be part of a more secure and resilient cyber infrastructure or critical infrastructure base. And it's certainly ambitious, and but I think it's become clear, or I think it's become clear, the importance of continuing to not only have a national cyber strategy, but also to implement it across all of these various industries. That's all I got. Be happy to answer any questions or continue to talk about this if you're interested. You want me to get you some? No. I presume cold? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Pringle. Commissioners, Commissioner Carol Lee Williams.
Thank you, Chair Balser. Mr. Pringle, you have referenced numerous times Government Accounting Office, the presidential decisions, and the U.S. Code. Is there something comparable happening within our state? Is there decision making that you're aware of that is focused in this arena in state government?
Well, there are, and this has been several years now, there are both for private organizations and governmental entities, the requirements in different forms and fashions to have policies and procedures and plans in place to protect personal information, sensitive personal information. And that's been, I don't know whether that was 2009, but there's certainly been some movement in that area, along with, as I mentioned, sort of a requirement to notify individuals in certain instances
Right.
when their personally identifiable information has been disclosed without authorization. Likewise, the South Carolina Department of Insurance, and then through the General Assembly, was the first state to pass a law and requirements that applied to certain types of entities regulated by the Department of Insurance in terms of having protecting information and the elements of an appropriate security program. So I guess you could say it's a little bit piecemeal in that instance, although, those, and I think all 50 states now have that requirement, that the notification that also contains in it some requirements for having a reasonable security program. I think one of the difficulties has been that because technology has changed so quickly, it's either been difficult or somewhat unadvisable to try to include a particular set of requirements for a particular set of technologies in those laws. Sometimes there are references made to some, and again, I want to be careful, into some national standards bodies that have, have various standards for different types of security. So it's an ongoing process.
Thank you.
Commissioners, Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. This is very interesting. Appreciate this. I see that the references in the back, you wrote 3 or 4 of them. And just wondering, is there something that you can talk about or would care to talk about that caused you to get so interested in this area?
Well, I appreciate the question. I think part of it was, and this actually goes back, and some of you remember, the commission was very active in the telecommunications industry for a time in the wake of the 1996 amendments to the 1934 Telecom Act, and so it was very sort of consumed for a number of years, but then that kind of, due to a variety of factors, that kind of waned, shall we say, but at the same time, that wireline telecom network was transitioning to more of a information technology. If you just think going from phones to computers, and so And some of those areas that it had already involved some privacy and security elements in the telecom industry, it seemed like a good transition. And it was certainly something, and I've probably mentioned this before, certainly not any sort of expert on computers, but we had 4 computers in our house when I was 10 years old, and that was 1978. So I've always had some, at least, familiarity with that, and then, you know, given that a regulatory practice seemed, you know, somewhat amenable to looking at a lot of these concepts, it was just a good transition. And there's no shortage of things that are happening to try to stay current on.
Well, if you had 4 computers in your home in 1978, you were definitely an early adopter. Did you have one of those refrigerated rooms to keep them cool?
No, they weren't. They weren't quite. They weren't quite that powerful or big. But I do remember my father had a modem that he used to send chapters of his book back to the university overnight, and they had these cables on them that would get. You had to, you know, get the, what is it, the, you know, the, not corrosion, but it was, you had to wipe them off because those modem cables would get, you know, some sort of, and he, like others, were absolutely amazed when modem speeds went from 120 bit to 300 bit. And they talked about that they probably would never get any faster. And that was also when, and this is something we really don't necessarily appreciate, he was so adamant that I save my work on the computer because he lost an entire chapter by failing to save something. And now we don't necessarily have to worry about that. We've got automatic save and such, but a lot of things have changed over the years. Some for the better, but some with, you know, lots of new challenges.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Anything further, commissioners?
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Urban?
thank you. Jack, I don't know if you listened to the congressional hearing recently about the TikTok concerns, and as someone who's kept abreast of all these developments, would you allow one of your employees to have use TikTok on an office computer or cell phone? Or do you have concerns about state actors trying to, you know, get information on a program like that?
That's a great question, and I kind of go back and forth on it. Out of full disclosure, I think I have 2 videos that are on TikTok, not particularly well liked, but I'm intrigued by, you know, this, and I'm only getting my information from the same places, about the proposition that as a Chinese company, ByteDance is, you know, required to interact with the PRC. So that is, you know, that is certainly troublesome. And I know that my own children have decided not to use it just because it, you know, it doesn't make them feel good. And I stopped using it because it was just too amazing the way it kept, you know, showing interesting things to me. The other side of it, and I'm also, it is very troubling, these allegations that are made, that surveilling journalists and things like that. The other side of the equation is that, and this is all happening in a context where I mean the Congress and the United States government has not managed to pass national privacy legislation, some of which has been pending for a while, and presumably, or some varieties of that might require every company like this, including the ones that happen to be owned here in the United States, to be a great deal more transparent about their information practices and to inform customers about exactly what they do or don't do with their data. So I think I can never answer a question in a short way, but I feel kind of strongly both ways. But I am of the mind that Congress taking some action more broadly, in addition to what they may be doing under IEPA or these other laws that enable the U.S. to limit or prohibit foreign companies. I think both those areas might be areas of concern. I've obviously caused Commissioner Irvin to leave.
No,
My
I
answer was.
appreciate that response. The final question I have is, what role do you see artificial intelligence playing going forward? Do you see some applications that might be available to investor-owned utilities, for example, with demand-side management and the like, or customer service, or is that out of the question? I'd just like to hear your thoughts on it.
Just to drill down a little bit on the question, you mean being able to interact with our those utilities being interact with law enforcement and others or tell me what you mean about intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, as I understand it, is going to replace a lot of potentially a lot of routine jobs, like an answering call center, where a customer could interact with the AI to get a certain outcome, or a problem, outage, for example, resolved. Do you see that evolving, or is that something that you've looked at?
Yeah, and now I understand your question. My apologies for not getting it at first. As with, my general view on these new technologies, I think there are a great many potential opportunities. And as someone said, I can't remember whether it was William Gibson or William Burroughs, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. There are a lot of what is, would be considered artificial intelligence, meaning bots that are answering questions, are already being employed by a lot of entities. And I think there's a lot of potential benefit from that. If the universe of questions and answers are ones that are providing fairly standard information. But I think as artificial intelligence really begins to ramp up, and this time now with ChatGPT-4 being introduced and others, it seems like a Precambrian explosion. As with using various technologies in critical infrastructure, the key is going to be at least trying to assess on the front end whether it's getting some transparency into the way the artificial intelligence works, what its data set is, what its training data is, and whether or not, for example, it does the things that we've all been reading about, hallucinating, making up things in certain contexts. But ultimately, I think that used judiciously and evaluated, and presuming there is some level of transparency that, and it may be regulators, but it may be customers, but certainly an organization that decides to use it there are a great many potential applications. But it's not a panacea, it's not a be-all, end-all, and it has to be tested and evaluated very rigorously, particularly in a public utility context, to make sure that the answers are appropriate and that customers continue to be taken care of. And it certainly cannot be chosen or used based solely on some sort of pure dollars and cents cost benefit analysis. You know, it's going to have to be taking time and evaluating and figuring out the use case in the first instance, and then having the ability to keep an eye on it and monitor it and adapt if appropriate and necessary.
Well, thank you for that response. I guess there are various agencies that could undertake a deep dive into the potential applications. I guess the Berkeley National Lab could, a nonprofit like that, could look at it and study it and make recommendations. What other agencies might come into play as we try to grasp, you know, the importance of some kind of process for evaluation?
That's, well, and I'll just go ahead and mention this, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, is active in just about everything that I've mentioned today in terms of creating potential standards and guidance for the evaluation and use of not only security protocols, but technologies like artificial intelligence. So I think there are going to be a great many resources that could be utilized in order to evaluate going forward.
Thank you.
Commissioners? Mr. Pringle, thank you for being here today and giving us the information. This is certainly thought-provoking. I get those emails and I have to glance in them. I'm always promised millions of dollars somewhere, and I wish that I could collect it somehow, but I hadn't figured out how to do that yet. So,
Well, that's, if you figure it out, let me know. I think
only after I collect mine first.
I'm gonna keep my day job. For
Yeah, I definitely am too. So,
Yeah.
but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very
It's my
informative.
pleasure.
Mr. Torrey, anything that you need to add, or as our neutral?
Strong enough
You're
for
on.
this?
You're on now.
Okay.
I can see the light. Unfortunately, you can't.
Okay. Sorry. No, we did, nothing that we need to add. We'll get with Mr. Pringle post fact and make sure we've got everything we need.
Thank you, sir. We certainly appreciate ORS having you here today to make sure that this runs smoothly. Commissioners, if there's nothing further, this allowable ex parte communication briefing is adjourned. Thank you very much.